Thank you for inviting me. I was very pleased to be able to chat with all of you about my research and what sort of things I'm starting to do with the connections between Scotland and New Zealand. And the background to this research is very simple. I was doing a project in New Zealand on their digital newspaper collections and how their collections were created and some of the ethical and technical questions that went into them. And as I was going through their collections, I started seeing all of these little hints that there were multiple conversations going on in the New Zealand press that were not necessarily part of the hub and spoke kind of conversations we often talk about with the imperial press going through London, or even going through some of the other main parts of the empire. So I was really interested in how provinces or regions or aspects sort of travel around the edges of empire without necessarily going through the center. And I wanted to study this, and I wasn't quite sure the best way to do it. So what this paper is going to explore is sort of the methodology of how we can kind of recreate these back channel conversations or these shared conversations on the edges of empire. And by edges of empire, I do not mean to imply that either Scotland or New Zealand was not at the heart of the British Empire, but rather that they are literally on opposite sides from each other and have to sort of talk over the middle, geographically speaking. So, the first thing I want to talk about is my initial research into this area before I started working with the digital newspapers in New Zealand, and that was really with the Australian and the Scottish press, which is a very different animal, as I soon discovered. But what I learned from that research is that there were gatekeepers throughout the imperial press. There were individual newspapers who more or less dictated how certain parts of the empire were seen by other parts of the empire, at least really until the transatlantic and later the Indian and Australian telegraph cables came into common use and people could get more direct connections with each other. Now, these gatekeepers were practical gatekeepers. They weren't necessarily the richest or the most well-connected in terms of political connections or even economic connections, but they did have often monopolies on the information going to and from certain locations. So the first set of gatekeepers were generally colonial gazettes, so the official organs of the British government in, for example, Sydney or the West Indies. These were most commonly the first newspapers to be established in major new colonial centers, and they were given a little bit of preferential treatment when it came to information coming back to Britain about those locations, particularly in Australia, where the Sydney Gazette had essentially a monopoly for 20 years on newspaper discourse about Australia. The other type of gatekeepers are very practical as well. They tended to be former journeymen. So people who had worked for newspapers in Scotland or in England, they had sort of got their craft, they had understood what they wanted to do, but there wasn't enough room or enough business for them in Britain, so they would go off to other parts of the empire and start newspapers. But they maintained very close friendships, or at least business partnerships, with their former employers. So they would act as news agents, bringing the home newspapers to the colonial areas, and they would act as stringers. So whenever their local newspaper back in Scotland or England needed a story about South Africa or about colonial New Zealand, they would ask their friend to send them a specific article. So they were gatekeepers, they were newspapermen, but it was through these friendships and these old employment relationships that really gave them their gatekeeper status. And the last set of gatekeepers were really shipping routes. Before the telegraph cables get implemented, and it's very, very late for the telegraph cables to make it to Port New Zealand from, in a connected way all the way to Britain, the shipping lanes that were used for commercial purposes and for immigrant schemes were the best way of shipping news back and forth. And that sort of dictated whose newspapers you could actually get a hold of. And one thing I learned about the Australian experience is that the shipping routes were so well known and the hunger for information was so great that they would actually make special editions of the newspapers to print the day before the ships left in order to send that kind of digest of information back to Britain. So these are all the sort of things I had in the back of my head when I started looking at New Zealand that had been the case in Australia. And one of the things I found, as is often the case in historical research, is that moment of serendipity where you're just browsing through a newspaper and you find the perfect article just staring at you in the face. So I was trying to create basically a PowerPoint slide for a different talk on sort of the layout and the structure of New Zealand newspapers. And I chose one sort of at random. And unlike most of the newspapers I had seen, which had English intelligence or home news, this particular issue of the New Zealand Gazette and Wellington Spectator had a section on Scotland. It was independent from the English news. Now, it may be difficult to see on your screen, but what the actual text begins with is, by serendipity themselves, they had got a couple of issues of the Scotsman on the last ship that had come to town, and so they were going to reprint a bunch of the news from the Scotsman for the local Scots in the area so they could feel like they had a little bit of home information in the newspaper. And I thought this was really wonderful, and it gave me a sense that maybe there is a separate back conversation going on in these newspapers between Scotland and New Zealand talking about each other. When I had done my original research for my PhD on immigration during the 18-teens and the 1820s, I had noticed that by the 1840s and 50s, there was a trickle of immigration news about New Zealand appearing in the Scottish press, and I kind of wanted to see if that conversation was reciprocated in New Zealand. I was very, very disappointed to find out that not only in the New Zealand Gazette and Wellington Spectator, but for all the newspapers in New Zealand for the next 20 years, this was basically the only Scotland section. Generally speaking, Scottish news was absorbed into English intelligence or home news as it had been in Australia. And in fact, most of the Scottish news came through Australia and they had already pre-curated it into sort of a standard reprint set. So there is quite a lot about Scotland printed in the New Zealand Gazette and the New Zealand newspapers in general, but it's only this one issue in 1842 that I could find this little separate section so far, which was a bit of a shame. So I had to begin a different approach. I went through Papers Past, and I went through Papers Past being the online New Zealand newspaper collection. I also had the benefit of having access to their back-end data. So 2 newspapers that have been digitized but aren't yet available on the online platform. And I started going through them one by one, looking for those special key phrases. So Scottish, Scotland, Scots, Scotch, which was a bit of a dangerous one to type in, and Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, major cities and towns, Inverness as well because of the Courier. And I just started cataloging them by hand. So when did it appear? Which newspaper did it appear in? What title was that information under? So I could kind of see if it was a story about Scotland or something that Scotland was just mentioned in, what type of news it is, and a little bit of notes so I could remember what article it was. And what I found pretty quickly is that, first of all, typing in Scotch is more useful in American newspapers than it was in the New Zealand newspapers. There were only 2 things that really came up with Scotch in the New Zealand press. One was obviously the liquor, and the second was the Scotch Church, which was only referred to as such when it was the physical building in Wellington. And that was really quite interesting because they tended to use it as the landmark in town. So it's where meetings were held, and also if a robbery had occurred, the robbers always seemed to run past the Scotch Kirk, or there was a parade that went past the Scotch Kirk. So for some reason, it was a major landmark in Wellington at that point. The rest of the information about Scotland, however, did bring some interesting things to light. The major topics that were discussed either in part or as whole articles about Scotland and New Zealand were things that I would say aren't stereotypical, but they are things that are nearing stereotypical about the Scots. So Scottish character as being particularly hardworking, willing to sort of endure hard conditions for lower pay. These things came up quite frequently. They'll tough it out even though things are hard. The things about Scottish education were frequently mentioned. So whenever they were attempting to institute parish or local schools, they would refer to the Scottish model and say how Scotland had achieved so much because they had this freer education than England or other parts of the empire. The migratory spirit of the Scots and the fact that New Zealand would do well to attract some of that migratory spirit was often mentioned, as were things that were either owned or adjacent to buildings owned by the established Church of Scotland, again, like a landmark. Far and away, though, there was a tendency to refer to England and Scotland as a pair. And I actually found this semantically quite interesting because it was very rarely connected to Ireland. So you didn't get a whole lot of Ireland and Scotland. Wales just didn't appear as part of this phrase. It was always England and Scotland. So this would come up in very practical things such as political returns in England and Scotland, cholera epidemics in England and Scotland, or this sort of thing would never happen back in England and Scotland if there was a particular outrage that had happened. So while the Scots were described somewhat separately in certain passages, there was a real sense that the union was of equal partners between England and Scotland, at least, even though this is 1840s to 70s, and that they were always used as a pair, as opposed to necessarily just Great Britain or the United Kingdom, which I thought was an interesting way of framing it. And part of that, I think, was the influx of Scottish migrants. Indeed, a lot of the advertisements for laborers who would come to Wellington and Nelson across the bay in the South Island would indicate that they were very experienced in all the agricultural practices of England as well as Scotland. So there was this sense that it kind of improved your credentials if you had both to your name. Some of the bits here are a little bit interesting. I don't know if you can make them out quite on your screen. There is a discussion in the bottom right about the fact that Canterbury mostly comes from England and Otago mostly comes from Scotland, but that shouldn't matter in the 1860s. We can all be friends now that we're in New Zealand together. That sort of sentiment was expressed during a period of Confederation. The other part, which may be a little bit more shocking, is in the top left, where they have a bit of poetry by Robert Burns. It says that this may be of interest to our Scottish readers, or indeed all of our readers, as Burns is a worldly poet and is almost essentially an Englishman, which made me cringe a little bit when I read it the first time. So there is a sense that there is an integration going on, but a recognition that there is some sort of ethnic difference. So I went through several decades of these, and I've still not processed all of them, but I've been finding quite a lot of interesting discussions about New Zealand in the Scottish newspapers and about Scotland in the New Zealand papers, and they seem to have a respect for each other and a sense that I absolutely had when I visited New Zealand, that temperature-wise, in terms of environment, it was very much like the area around St. Andrews. It felt very much like Clackmannanshire or like Fife in terms of its weather, at least in the North Island, in Wellington's region. So I didn't find it at all surprising that they would often make that connection. They would refer to areas being similar to the Isle of Arran or to other parts of Scotland when trying to describe the climate to those back home. But this is not the only way that people have conversations, talking directly about each other. One of the ways I wanted to understand if there was a back channel conversation going on was, are they in the same kind of bubble? So if we think of Facebook or Twitter and those sort of accusations that you only listen to people who are in your own political or such group, I wondered if that sort of thing was going on as well. And it would be a bit naive and a bit too simplistic to just say, well, this is a Tory paper or a Whig paper or a Liberal paper. I really wanted to see if they were looking at the same articles, were they sharing the same links, so to speak. So I've put the British Library Scottish newspapers, so the Aberdeen Journal, Glasgow Herald, and Caledonian Mercury. I'm also trying to get a hold of the Scotsman, though I haven't got the data for that yet. And I did essentially plagiarism software detection on those with the New Zealand papers I had. And this was an attempt to see not just when they were talking about each other, but when they happened to be looking at the same articles, not necessarily having obtained them from each other, but having obtained them from anywhere else in the Anglophone or indeed the global news network. Now, this was sort of limited because I only had the 3 Scottish newspapers digitized, but I'm hoping to expand this further in the future. There was a limited number of hits in the first 10 years in the 1840s. That's to be expected, though, because there were only 2 newspapers in New Zealand that I had access to for the first few years, and there's just only so many possible chances that they're actually going to have a match. But it did give me some interesting insights into these discourse bubbles. So, what did they talk about? Well, this is very much a discussion about resolution. So if I talk about it at a very low resolution, you will be not at all surprised and not at all impressed by my research. So they talked about Victoria and the happenings at court. They talked about parliamentary business. They looked at military and political matters in the West Indies, China, India, and the US. And they shared a lot of miscellany. Basically, disaster stories, shocking tales of crime and murder, strange poetry. Those were the things that actually seemed to be the most viral and pop up in both places. Now, if I were being a bit more specific about it, it wasn't just that there was a broad range of material. Yes, court, parliament, politics, military, and miscellany would describe basically any newspaper in Scotland in this period. The particulars they gave were quite interesting, though. When it came to regional news within Britain, news about Northern England or Wales or even Scotland, those were not things that seemed to pop up very often. Even London news seemed to come up very, very rarely, except in those cases of sensational murder trials or things like that. If it wasn't a high-ranking parliament business or a law, or Victoria herself, which they seemed to talk about every time she went to Scotland on holiday, that definitely made it across. It really was about the empire. So there was lots of shared news on India, shared news on China, the West Indies, Canada, and a bit on the United States as well. So they seem to have common interest about areas outside of themselves. It was not Australia or Australasia, and it was not Scotland where they were, or Britain, they were sharing their news. It was the other places in the empire, and they shared a lot of detail about that. Very long articles about things that basically probably didn't have a whole lot of direct impact on their lives, but were important for them to understand within the imperial culture and the imperial situation. And if you look sort of on the side of my slide, you have a popish plot, an earthquake, and some parliamentary scandals. You also have, I found quite interesting, this did not show up because I didn't think to search for Highland originally. I thought it was too vague a term. But a lot of historical curiosities or history lessons were shared between Scotland and New Zealand, and they often took place in sort of ancient or Neolithic Scottish tombs and ruins, and things like that would be shared quite frequently. Everyone likes history documentaries, even in the 1850s. So I've got all of this data and I wanted to figure out what to do with it. I have instances where they talk about each other. And I have instances when they are sharing the same stories and therefore perhaps have a similar worldview. We are known not just by what we say, but what we choose to share about other people that we're talking about. So I wanted to figure out how to discuss this in a both slightly quantitative way and a very deeply documented way. So the way I would have done my research 10 years ago, the way I did my research 10 years ago, is I read thousands of newspaper articles. I pulled together the various themes that I thought were interesting. I gathered illustrative examples, funny examples, sad examples, and I tried to put together a narrative that kind of gave a sense of this shared dialogue or this shared community. I wanted to do something different. So with my PhD student, who is doing a similar project with India and Britain, we developed a program called Nisaba. Now, Nisaba is an ancient Sumerian goddess of the archive, which is amazing. They have a goddess of the archive, so that's what we named it after. And what this program allows you to do is input either text or images, but I've used it mostly for text, and then to segment the text on a word-by-word basis. So I can, and it's a little hard to see here, but I can highlight just a few words or a sentence from my text, and then I can either put notes attached to that bit of text, or I can use a controlled vocabulary, an ontology that I've created, to tag that. And the idea behind this was, rather than use computerized topic modeling, which gives you a sense of how often certain words appear together in certain texts, I wanted to create a much more semantically meaningful segmentation of these texts. So if I took, for example, the passage from the poem by Burns, where it talks about it may be of interest to Scottish readers, and Burns was, nearly an Englishman, I can highlight that and label it under nationality, ethnicity. I can label it under Scottishness. I can label it under group identities, various terms. And the point of this is that once I have segmented it all these different sections, I can run an analysis that will look very much like this. So if, for example, I've got 14 instances of Scottish character being discussed, within 100 words before it, usually the topics of immigration or parliament come, or 100 words, and this is illustrative based on the ones I've hand done so far. It's not a big scale yet. Or the same item would include these different topics. And the hope is that once I have completed inputting the entire 20 or 30 years of these references, I will be able to create a very detailed map of what topics are shared, and if the topics are about each other, what those topics are connected to. What are they in reference to, or what is the context in terms of the text around those individual things. So it's one thing to say there are 30 articles that talk about Scottish characteristics, but if those Scottish characteristics are always embedded in articles about education or about parliament or about immigration, that gives you a very different feeling for the quantitative weight of that idea of those topics. Now, what I'm hoping for here is clarity rather than accuracy. In the end, no matter how diligent I am in keyword searching and looking for reprints, I'm only going to be able to get a slice of the actual public sphere as it existed between 1840 and 1870. However, by creating this database and making it open access, which I intend to do once it's completed, I will have the ability to say that this topic is most intertwined with this, and give a very long list of very specific examples right down to this particular clauses or pairs of sentences in these articles. So in the end, it's still my interpretation. It's still using historical judgment in a traditional sense. It's just heavily documented historical judgment. And in that way, hopefully people can add to it or build upon that in the future to answer their own questions about these sort of overlapping networks. So why bother? Why do it this way? Why not just read lots of news articles and come up with my interpretation? It would certainly be a lot less work. And I would like to think of it as the fact that it is iterative and disjointed. Sampling, which is sort of the traditional practice, offers amazing anecdotal and really intriguing examples, but there is a limited context. There's a limited sense of the representativeness of any examples you find. It's all based on your judgment, and the more in depth you go into individual articles, the less you can spend on context and showing that representativeness. Now, a talented writer can do both, and it is always a balancing act. But I think that the richest and most intriguing close readings often do have to limit their context just because of the amount of space and bandwidth those can provide. Big data has the opposite problem. If you offer this really wonderful longitudinal change, you have hundreds and thousands of articles being tested for certain keywords or certain turns of phrase, something that is often referred to as culturenomics. It's really great, on the one hand, because it gives you these raw linguistic hits. There was a study, I believe at Bristol a few years ago, where they tried to find the happiest decade of the Victorian period by finding which newspaper issues had the happiest words. When was Victorian Britain the happiest? And in some way, and this was not a project I was involved in, it was something colleagues were involved in, but it was wonderful in one respect, but it only raised more questions. It didn't actually answer those questions, in my opinion, because it was just the first layer. And I think that the close readings, as I said before, offer this limited scale. So you can go back to newspapers over and over again. That's why I say it's iterative. And it's disjointed because it's not necessarily that one project leads naturally to the next, and that your research will lead naturally and act as the foundation and the starter material for the next project. Maybe a little bit of it will. Maybe some of it will get thrown away. Maybe it wasn't useful. The project that I did for the Research Society of Victorian Periodicals issue, a lot of that was very useful. Some of it showed that the process was far from perfect, and I'd have to go back to the drawing board, and that was okay with me. Dead ends are natural. You've got to try different methodologies to see how they work, and they're not profitless. I have learned a huge amount from the fact that that first article that I found was serendipity, that it was something unusual in 1842 September. So I tried to take all of these different methodologies as a way of sounding the historical record in different ways and seeing if I can get slightly different perceptions of one single 3D object back by looking at it from different ways. So, my main conclusion from my study into Scotland and New Zealand press so far is that we are a combination of three things. We are our expressions about other people, how we talk about other people. We are how other people talk about us. And we are the expressions or the written work that we consume. What is our worldview? What is our knowledge base? Where do we think the world exists around us? And it's really by only looking at those three things, which you have to look at in very different ways, that you can get kind of a sense of conversations that happened in the past. So, in conclusion, this paper is an advocation of what my colleague Sydney Shep has referred to as rich data, as opposed to big data in the digital humanities. And in order to develop a rich data understanding of how the regional public spheres overlapped and were perceived by one another, you have to leverage multiple points of entry. There is absolutely no reason why doing a simple plagiarism check across these collections would offer me a true sense of their shared conversation without going through each and every hit and trying to map that out semantically and in detail. It's a lot of work, but it is very, very profitable. I also think that we need to really take into account a robust provenance of textual reappearance. This is something that many people have started studying over the past 5 or 6 years, and it's very important for us to understand that just because something is a copy doesn't mean the person agreed with the thing they were copying. And on the other hand, it doesn't mean that they're not expressing something unique and individual about themselves by reprinting it. So I think that textual reappearance is not just noise or, viral advertising gone mad. It really is a way of communication that we should take very seriously. And finally, I would just say that for anyone who does any kind of research into representation or research into descriptions of objects, that creating an ontology, a controlled vocabulary for your research, where you state that this is the term I'm going to use for coding certain primary sources or segments of primary sources, and these are the criteria, the constrained criteria I'm going to use, has been a very fulfilling process for me. I used to have these very out of control ontologies and coding schema that would grow as the project continued, and their meaning would change as the project went on. And in the one hand, that's okay because everything's evolving. But I think having to stop for a minute and really think about the language I was using to describe these things and how those terms related to each other in an ontological fashion made me a better historian. It made me think about the way I was using language to describe other people's use of language in a much more nuanced way, as opposed to kind of saying, I know what this word means, everyone's going to know what I mean by this, and they're going to agree with me that this falls under this category. And none of those things are actually true. So I think I will leave it there to open up for some questions, but I thank you very much for listening, and I hope I can help you with anything you have about either the Scots-New Zealand conversation or about the methodologies I'm implementing to discover it. Thank you very much.